Richard?
Frantz Fanon.
Yes. He's really in the tradition of Frantz Fanon, who says in the last chapter of Wretched for the Earth, which he was writing when he was dying. I mean, he finished it 3 days before he died, Fanon. And he says that it is important for us, right? Fanon is of a colonized people. He's an Algerian that's colonized by the French. And he says it's really important for us to understand that we don't want to destroy the Europeans, that we don't want to destroy white people. We want to show them the way to have a better life, to have the possibility of freedom. In a sense, what he was saying, I'll use old language, he was saying that colonized people, Pan-Africans, are really in the forefront of the struggle for all of our freedom. And that's how I always saw Alambe. And Alambe was always, besides everything else he was friendly, was interested in your ideas as much as his ideas, right? My friend Mr. Solomon there, we were talking about a discussion that he had with Alambe.
What's his full name?
What?
What's his full name?
Oh, Alambe Bratt.
You
I'm
forgot
sorry.
to mention it.
I forgot. I just took it for granted. You know, Russell probably had no problem thinking, oh, Alambe. Do you know? Well, because if you knew Alambe, if you met Alambe, that was one of the, you know, it's that he was Alambe. He was really unique and special. And it's very sad. And one of the great things, and I'll end with this, I tend to be wordy. I'll end with this, that one of the great things about being on WBAI for 15 years is meeting people, the few people like Alambe that are there. It's not true of most of the people that are there, but it was true of Alambe. And I'm a better person for knowing them. And then I'll be Irish. Alambe, we hardly knew ye.
Yeah. Amen. I think.
Would you like to say something, Russell? Because you were at the funeral, you might have.
Yeah, well, the funeral was really, really moving, and it was, you know, it was, what was amazing was it wasn't just mourning. I mean, it was very sad. It's very sad that he's gone, but it was also very uplifting, and the message was, you know, this the struggle that Alambe was part of, and that he did so much to propagate and create. Goes on, and it was amazing. There were people from Namibia, from all over Africa who had come to the funeral, who read statements. There were people from Mbeki sent word. He didn't come, but Mbeki sent word, and we, you know, and
Fidel Castro.
Fidel Castro wrote a letter which was read. Mumia sent a statement. Recorded a statement from prison.
Wow.
And yeah, it was quite moving, and it wasn't let's mourn. It was, you know, goodbye Alambe. We're moving on. So you're not forgotten, because we're not going to stop acting and working.
And several people spoke about the Central Park 5.
And many people spoke about the Central Park 5, which was really wonderful, because that is a major issue today. I mean, which needs to be resolved. The Central Park 5 are innocent. They were innocent. They were known to be innocent for over 10 years, and yet the city still has not paid reparations for taking away so much of the lives of those young people who were, for, you know, this racist and white supremacist system we lived in had so much of their lives taken away when they were accused in 1989 of this horrible crime, which no question was a horrible crime, but they didn't do it. They had nothing to do with it. And yet they were accused and tried in the court of public opinion, not in the
prison,
and in the legal courts, and they were sent to prison.
But they did say that, you know, DiFazio stopped the, you know, Bloomberg was fighting.
Well, he
Friday?
promised, de Blasio promised, and we're waiting for him to come through,
Oh,
because
I
he's
thought
been
it
dragging
already
his feet.
happened.
He promised he was gonna see reparations come about, and that hasn't happened
Well, I
yet.
think that the last I heard was that he stopped the countersuit or whatever.
Did he end it?
Yeah, which is like only a step in that
It's only a
direction.
step, but it has to,
only a
it's,
step.
you know, there's.
Well, they said, because Bloomberg was gonna fight it the whole way.
Yeah. And there are people who are out there who want to fight it the whole way. And,
You know, after that film, you'd think like, okay, get this done, you know.
well,
There
after
was
that
no
film, but I
getting
mean, that
around-
film really, for those of us especially who are around WBAI, who have listened to WBAI for many years, WBAI has, and we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk a little bit about media and, you know, how this plays out, you know, in ideology, but, you know, Sharon was on WBAI since 1989 saying Yusuf is innocent. And WBAI was the only place that was saying, the only media outlet that was saying, this is nonsense, this is not what happened. And for us, there was nothing new in that film, and, you know,
Sorry.
I think we need to step up and really fight for this to happen. And it was a lot of talk, a lot of people, yeah, Marla, yeah.
What was Bloomberg's reason for trying to countersue?
Yeah, it's gonna cost them money, and it shows, Bloomberg doesn't want to show what the system is. He
Well,
doesn't
the
want it.
police chief was the reason, you know,
Yeah.
Kelly.
you always start by saying no,
Yeah. You say,
whatever it
you
is,
don't admit
that
whatever.
you were wrong, you can't.
And what they're saying, I mean, what they've been maintaining is, well, you know, we did the best, we acted in good faith. Okay, oops. There it is,
That's the way
okay.
the law works.
Oh, well, you took these young kids' lives away. You know, you know, there's been a lot of talk, and I think we really need to push the idea of passing legislation to require, and some people mentioned this yesterday, and I've been talking with Yusuf Salam's mother, Sharon Salam, who's on the board of WBAI with me. I'm also on the board. We've been talking about, we need to have legislation where police interrogations are recorded, because we need to know how these phony confessions get recorded. How does this happen? What happened to these kids that they confessed to a crime that they didn't commit? Because that's what convicted them. They confessed to it. And 4 of them did. Yusuf did not confess to it. He said, I'm not confessing to something I didn't do. But the other 4, they terrorized. Basically, they were kids. They were 13, 14 years old, and they scared them into confessing to a crime they didn't commit. And this happens all the time in the system. So anyway, that was a big part of what we discussed yesterday, yeah.
Well, I know the woman that produced the show with Becca last night, she had got run over by a bus 3 years ago, MTA bus, and now she's a multimillionaire. So
That was quick.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. 3 years ago? Pretty
Yeah.
quick.
Well,
This is what was it, 89, 99, 2009? How many years are we talking? I mean, we're talking
Exactly.
26 years, 25 years.
Absolutely.
Quarter of a century.
Interest.
Yeah. So,
this is all interesting and actually all related to ideology.
right, exactly.
And I'm going to start,
Okay, yeah.
since Russell said he didn't care.
Yeah.
And
Just
last
don't use
year
all the- Don't use the quotes I'm gonna use.
I'm going to use, I don't know. I tried to leave my quotes. I only quoted, I didn't use any of my quotes from Volume 3 of Capital, and, you know, I mean, people like Althusser like to say that the end of ideology is kind of the end of the philosophical works, and that Marx really, you know, leaves
Right.
out things like alienation and ideology. But how does he explain that he mentions such things as alienation and ideology in Volume 3 of Capital? Right? And Volume 1, I was going to use a quote from Volume 1 of Capital on the working day, a footnote, but I have this other quote from the working day, because that I want to talk about. I've always found out that when I give a paper that I never get to the conclusion, so I'm going to, you know, partially give you the conclusion before I start. So this is not starting. This is like a prelude or something. And, okay, it's the overture, right, except I'm not musical. That's the problem, I guess. But I've been watching all these old movies. I watched Helen of Troy yesterday, and it starts off with an overture. And this terrible movie has a 15-minute overture. It was the best part of the movie. Okay.
Who did it? Who wrote it?
Oh, I didn't even look. I was actually writing this paper so I could talk about this today. Marx starts off, I'm basically going to use part one of the German ideology by Marx and Engels. And I'm going to update it. I want to show that the relevance of these things to this day. I mean, I'll just ask a question. Why can we never say the word ruling class, even at this conference? I went to the opening plenary with Stanley and Cornell and three other folks that I don't know who they were. And Cornell and Stanley are old friends. And I never hear the word ruling class. And I just went to a thing on Thomas Paine, and Thomas Paine is writing against monarchy. And who are the monarchy? Well, the monarchy is the ruling class. And what does Thomas Paine say in Common Sense? He says, all power to the people, right? That's Thomas Paine, right? All power to the people. And it was a very popular button in the 1960s. People used to walk around with all power to the people, and they would say Thomas Paine under it. And that's the only reason I remember that. But I want to start off with the critique of the young Hegelians, which is how the book starts off in the preface. The preface is a critique of the young Hegelians, and in 25 words or less, and I'll develop this in a little while, in 25 words or less, what he says is that the young Hegelians seem like radicals, that their philosophy seems to be a radical philosophy. They seem like they are wolves, quote Marx and Engels, but they are actually sheep. And their philosophy is really the bourgeois philosophy. And I want to make an argument that all of the liberal economists, Stieglitz and Krugman and Piketty, are really bourgeois in a high sense. It's nice that Piketty has created this spectacular database. But did we really need another database to know that there was inequality? And, you know, for how long have people been telling us about how capitalism and inequality go together with the same way that Stokely said many years ago that violence is as American as cherry pie, and capitalism and violence and inequality are as global as Thai cherry pie. So I want to do a little critique of that to show how liberal economists actually have a conservative agenda. It's like imagining that MSNBC is the radical station. I'm an old New Lefter hippie.
Where does Rick Wolf fit in there?
What?
Where does Rick Wolf fit?
Well, Rick is my friend. I don't want to say anything about Rick. I have my own problems with Rick, but they're not that. You know, and you know, I mean, we could argue about that. I mean, the second thing I want to talk about is the famous camera obscura quote, where many people have taken this quote incorrectly. And they've used the camera obscura metaphor to talk about if Marx and Engels have an incorrect theory of metaphors and Hegel's notion of inversion. The world upside down. And what's really important, and what Russell was just talking about, is that in the Central Park 5 situation, the ideology of racism is real in the world. It functions in a real way. It functions as a form of massive oppression. Americans do not know that the majority of poor people in the United States are white. Those lazy white people. Those irresponsible white people. And what's interesting, and as a result of this, I'm going to talk, I mention this, because I want to talk about the dean in this. I'm going to talk about a sociologist also. I'm going to talk mostly about the camera obscura, but I'm going to talk about Charles Murray. Charles Murray is the dean of conservative thinkers on poverty. But he has a quandary. And in his newest book, Coming Apart, he talks about how more and more white people are unemployed, are using drugs, are going to jail, are doing all kinds of bad things. My first wife dreamed her whole life about living in Minersville. When she was a little girl and grew up in Minersville, Pennsylvania, she was going to go back there. It was going to be heavenly in her old grandmother's house. She forgot that even when she was growing up in Minersville, Pennsylvania, coal mining, I mean, what else would it be in Pennsylvania? Coal mining or gold mine? No, coal mining, Pennsylvania, that part of Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and West Virginia, never actually came out of the Depression. Never. The Depression never just, I mean, I know I spent a long time with those people. I spent 15 years with those people in Minersville, Pennsylvania. Spent time with coal miners, going into coal miners, and seeing that they all had black spots all over their body, but especially in the whites of their eyes from coal explosions. And the dean, this dean of conservative thinkers, he is not any less conservative. He still believes that African Americans are biologically and genetically inferior. But the quandary is, can he say that about white people? And he doesn't really deal with that. So I want to make it known that I am a genetically inferior white person. So, you know, maybe I should get fired from my job. Maybe I shouldn't be speaking up here as a genetically inferior white people. After all, I was a drug addict. The third thing I want to talk about, and this gets back to why we're not allowed to say ruling class, is he says that the ideas of the ruling class are the ruling ideas of society. It's actually the name of the heading. He has more to say on it than that. This should not be shocking. This should not be shocking. I mean, we live in a world where we make less and less money, and everything gets more expensive, and no one is outraged. We believe in the ideas of the ruling class. We believe that technology creates jobs, when technology never created more jobs. In capitalism, from the very beginning, read Engels in The Conditions of the English Working Class, 1844, where he gives you the genesis from the spinning wheel through the jenny, through the self-acting mule, where hundreds and hundreds of people are displaced. From that self-acting mule, and they fight back. And they call themselves Luddites, after a fictional character named Ned Ludd. And to this day, because I hear it when I teach, I hear it in the cafeteria at St. John's University where I work, except I know the goddamn history. I've read my Engels many times.
What was the book?
Conditions in the English Working Class, 1844.
No, what book did Ludd come from?
Oh, Ludd is just a mystical character. He didn't come from any book. He was made up by the Luddite movements. You could read the history of the Chartists by Thompson. I can't think of her first name.
Didn't the Unabomber talk about technology too?
What?
Didn't the Unabomber talk about technology?
I don't know. I don't know anything about the Unabomber. But let me go on. You know, to this day, Luddites are seen as crazy. Maybe you would break the machines if the machines ruined your life. And what are we going to do about the kind of surveillance that the computer has enabled? What are we going to do about it? Just say, well, WikiLeaks and Manning and Snowden, they're great. Oh, that's not enough. We got to do something. We got to think about these things. And this leads into the fourth part, and arguably the most important part. It's what Sarah Hoffman, in her book on Camera Obscura and Ideology, doesn't understand when she writes that Marx is and Engels were just had not understood the metaphors of the Camera Obscura. Is that these things become real. That these things control our lives, that we believe that technology will create jobs, allows us to put off the struggle to control technology. I'm not a technophobe, but we have to control technology democratically. We have to take control. We cannot take control of our lives in the 21st century without taking control of technology. And the fourth piece, counter-ideology. Our weakest point. What the left is worst at. What Stanley and Cornell pointed to in the opening, Stanley Aronowitz and Cornell West pointed to in the opening plenary, that we must take control of our lives and we must have an alternative to the dominant ideology called capitalism. And we don't. We don't have that alternative. We don't have a counter-ideology. I mean, I've been fighting for years for a guaranteed annual income, that when people are displaced by technology, we have to learn from what the longshoremen, especially on the East Coast, the mafia-run longshoremen on the East Coast did. They got a guaranteed annual income. And every worker that was displaced by technology got full pay. They had to be available for work. If there was no work, they were free for the day. I've been struggling my whole life in the tradition of the Chartists, who struggled for the 10-hour day in the late 18th century and the early 19th century for the charter. And part of the charter was the struggle for the 10-hour day. I'm in the tradition of Albert Parsons and others who were hung because of the unexplained murder of cops, even though the unexplained murder of 60 working people at a picnic was unexplained the week before. In the beginning of the struggle for the 8-hour day, which we got in 1937, it is a long time. It is time for a 5-hour day. I disagree with Stanley. 6 hours is too many hours. With no reduction in pay, it would do away with unemployment immediately. And I would also argue with no overtime. And people have to be paid real living wages. I'm supposed to be an expert on poverty. I have a book that's been very well received called Ordinary Poverty, a little food and cold storage. And what's interesting about poverty is that poor people, not only do they want to work, they do work. I spent 22 years with poor people in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and I started working as an organizer for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Bedford-Stuyvesant in 1964 until SNCC became a Black Power organization. And I kept my friends there, and I still was friendly with them, but I couldn't be formally part of the group anymore. But the reality is that the great majority of poor people on welfare work off-the-books jobs. Yes, some do crime. Some do drugs and sell drugs and prostitution. But it's hard to make a living in this world, even in drugs and prostitution. Only on CSI do they make a good living. But with off-the-book jobs, for men usually in construction, for women usually in child care, elder care, and housework, with the welfare, they're still poor. I want to know in this country, what are the people called who are below the median income line and not at the poverty line yet? What are they called? I would argue that everybody who is below the median income is poor. And I will tell you how they've reduced poverty, global poverty in the world. They changed the statistics. So a person in India who makes $10 a day is now upper middle class.
80% of India makes less than 50 cents a day today.
And the women, mostly women who make my Dell computer, are paid 18 cents an hour. But you know, most of the job loss is not the outsourcing. Most of the job loss is to technology. And the Dutch, this is scary for those Chinese women who work for 18 cents an hour. The Dutch have already invented a technology that can put the computers together for less than 18 cents an hour. They just have to, you know, develop it and circulate it. I have actually an article here on that. Okay, that's what I'm going to talk about. Tell me when I'm finished, Russell.
Well, how long do you want to talk for?
What?
How long do you want to talk for?
I don't know, until you stop me.
What
It's
time
the-
do we go to? What time is?
We go to 5:40.
5:40, so, okay, we're at,
4:20.
what is it?
4:20.
4:20.
So how much time do I have?
Well, if I'm gonna talk and we're gonna have questions and discussion, let's say 25 more minutes?
Okay, just stop me.
25 minutes, okay.
Just stop me. It's the bad thing about being a radio host. Though I do watch the clock.
Can somebody watch the clock? Will somebody be official timekeeper? And just
So
give,
what time would you like?
let's say, just raise your hand for 20 minutes, and then
Okay.
we'll know that we'll wrap it up.
I want to quote something from Volume 1 of Capital. It's my favorite chapter. It's chapter 10. It's called The Working Day. And it's the first part of the chapter. This is where he explains exploitation and other things. But he has ideological... you do know that standpoint analysis comes out of Marx and Engels to a great extent. On the basis of class. Oh, another word we're not allowed to say anymore. All these words we're not allowed to say anymore. It's ruling class, class. But what is a working day? At all events, it is less than a natural day. How much less? The capitalist has his own views of this point of no return. The necessary limit of the working day. As a capitalist, he is only capital personified. His soul is the soul of capital. But capital has one soul, driving force. The drive to valorize itself, and now he's going to explain what that means, to create surplus value. That is, to create more value than you were paid in a wage. That's what exploitation is. Exploitation is that your wage is less than the value you create. I mean, it's his version of the labor theory of value, which he takes basically from Adam Smith, Ricardo, and then changes it. Capital is dead labor. Dead labor, I know, this building is constructed, and the labor that was used to construct this building is called constant capital, and it's dead labor. Okay, it's not here anymore. And they get no credit. The worker gets absolutely no credit for building this building. Capital is dead labor, which, famous quote, which vampire-like lives only by sucking living labor, and lives the more labor it sucks. The time during which the worker works is the time during which the capitalist consumes the labor power he has bought for him. If the worker consumes his disposable time for himself, he robs the capitalist. I have to explain a few things. There is an argument that they never have because Adam Smith is dead, but there's an argument. And the argument says that the worker and the capitalist, this is Adam Smith, says the worker and the capitalist meet in the marketplace and they make a deal. And the deal is that the worker sells to the capitalist his labor time for a wage. Now, the difference between Adam Smith and Marx in this tells a whole story. And it tells you the story of ideology. The capitalist says that this is a fair exchange. Marx says it's exploitation. You make up your own mind. But we haven't had the second part of the ideological struggle, which is missed often, too often. The capitalist, therefore, takes his stand on the law of commodity exchange. Like all other buyers, he seeks to extract the maximum possible benefit from the use value of his commodity. What is the use value of his commodity, the worker? The use value is surplus value, as the worker can create surplus value. Suddenly, however, there arises the voice of the worker. We have here ideological analysis. We have the standpoint of the capitalist versus the standpoint of the worker. Suddenly, however, there arises the voice of the worker, which had previously been stifled in the sound and fury of the production process. The worker speaks. The commodity I have sold you differs from the ordinary crowd of commodities in that its use creates value, a greater value than it costs. That is why you bought it. What appears on your side as the valorization of capital is on my side an excess expenditure of labor power. You and I know on the market only one law, that of the exchange of commodities, and the consumption of the commodity belongs not to the seller who parts with it, but to the buyer who acquires it. The use of my daily labor power, therefore, belongs to you. But by means of the price you pay for it, every day I must be able to reproduce it every day, thus allowing myself to sell it again. Apart from the natural deterioration through age, etc., I must be able to work tomorrow with the same normal amount of strength, health, and freshness as today. You are constantly preaching me the gospel of saving and abstinence. This is very important on the socio-cultural level, what he just said, because the basis of capitalist production is the despoiling of human life and the elevation of toil and suffering to a place of normalcy in life. If you don't toil and suffer, you are not a good person. And so the capitalist who just accumulates talks that when he plays golf, he's doing work. That when he flies to Europe in his own jet, he's doing work. That when he drinks the fanciest scotch, he's doing work. He's suffering and toiling. And we all believe in suffering and toiling. And we all suffer and toil. We wouldn't be good capitalists, laborers, if we weren't suffering and toiling. There's a great article about this called Affirmative Culture by Herbert Marcuse. It's in a book called Negations. Just an article, 40 pages. Very well, like a sensible, thrifty owner of property, I will husband my soul wealth, my labor power, and abstain from wasting it foolishly. Every day I will spend, set in motion, transfer into labor, only as much of it as is compatible with its normal duration and healthy development. By an unlimited extension of the working day, you may in one day use up a quantity of labor power greater than I can restore in 3. What you gain in labor, I lose in the substance of labor. A little economic thing here. It's very simple. Using my labor and despoiling it are quite different things. If the average length of time an average worker can live while doing a reasonable amount of work is 30 years, the value of my labor power, which you pay me from day to day, is 1 over 365 times 30, or 1 over 10,950 of its total value. But if you consume it in 10 years, you pay me daily 1/10,950th instead of 1 over 3,650 of its total value, i.e., only 1/3 of its daily value. And you therefore rob me every day of 2/3 of the value of my commodity. You pay me for 1 day's labor power while you use 3 days of it. That is against our contract and the law of commodity exchange. I therefore demand a working day of normal length, and I demand it without appeal to your heart, for in money matters sentiment is out of place. You may be a model citizen, perhaps a member of the RSPCA, and you may be in the odor of sanctity as well, but the thing you represent when you come face to face with me has no heart in its breast. What seems to throb there is my own heartbeat. See, the ideology of the capitalist is that they are the job creators. But in this argument for the counter-ideological argument made by this worker is that you only exist because of me. I am your heartbeat. How many times did we get to see the Woolpons slide into second base, or George Steinbrenner pitch a game? Did he ever pitch a game? Moneyball. It's just another word for exploitation. What seems to throb here in my own heartbeat? I demand a normal working day because, like every other seller, I demand the value of my commodity. The point of the working day, which Marx talks mostly in a chapter, I don't know the number of it, towards the end of volume 3, which is an incomplete chapter, is called the Holy Trinity chapter. And he talks about the realm of freedom. The realm of freedom exists when necessity is reduced to a minimum. And we have free time. And when we have free time, we can be a hunter in the morning, a fisherman in the afternoon, and a critical philosopher in the evening. Russell has chosen to be a critical philosopher all the time. See, in a way, the ideology of capitalism is the ideology in which suffering and toil are legitimated at every point. So we almost can't imagine free time except for, thank God it's Friday. Why do we call it, thank God it's Friday? And now, in this endless economic crisis, I mean, we have a crisis every few years, right?
I thought it was over.
It's over. It's over for Jamie Dimon. It's not over for the rest of the world. Now, this is interesting. That was a perfect thing to say, because I have a second quote here. I worked at St. John's Bread and Life Soup Kitchen for 22 years. And I wrote a book about it called Ordinary Poverty. A little food in cold storage. Where does that little food in cold storage come from? I'm feeding people soup one day, and this guy comes in, whom I know lives in the Greenpoint Soup Kitchen. Housing shelter. And I say, well, how you doing? And he says, well, you know, Bill, it's a little food in cold storage. That's his life. He eats a little food in the soup kitchen, and then he sleeps at night in the Greenpoint shelter, cold storage. I'm an ethnographer. Everything I say comes out of other people's mouths. There's no originality in me. So I helped develop this MOMS program with Jan Popendick and Hossein Sadat. And one of the requirements so we could get some funding was that we had to do a study, and I did the study, which was used. But I had to have open-ended studies. I also had quantitative questions as well. I'm trained in quantitative analysis, even though I think it's mostly bullshit. So I go to this woman, and let me say the quote, and then I'll explain the quote. She says to me, "I ain't got no boom." I say, no, what do you mean you don't have no boom? We're in the midst of the economic boom of the 1990s. You must have a boom. Unemployment is low. She says, no one has a job here. We only have odds and end jobs. Odds and end jobs is what they called off-the-book jobs in Bed-Stuy. We only have odds and end jobs. We don't have real jobs. We ain't got no boom. We ain't got no work. Perfect response to that the recovery is over. I ain't got no boom. But the poor are only a category. They are not a class. Why are the poor not a class? From Weber's point of view, the great Max Weber, the poor would be a class. Because class is measured by income and wealth. But for Marx, there's a third component to class. Always. It's what Sarah Kaufman doesn't understand. She uses a Kantian dialectic. I'm not saying you should use Hegel's dialectic. I'm saying you should use Marx's historical dialectic. And in the historical dialectic, if you want a third component, it is class struggle. If you are not willing to make class struggle, you don't exist as a class. If you are not conscious of yourself as a class, you are not a class.
You've got about a minute.
I got a minute. Well, I'm going to go to the end then. I told you, I talk about Charles Murray, who has a quandary. What do you do with all these poor white people? I talk about that the people who measure inequality have a problem because they don't talk about, I wrote all this stuff yesterday. They don't talk about the place of capitalism and inequality. They somehow leave it out. There's an elephant in the room, Paul Krugman. And why don't you see it? Why won't you mention it? I've read almost all of Paul Krugman's books. I've read all of Stieglitz's recent books, and I'm in the midst of reading Piketty with his better data set. No, this is what I want. So just let me finish here. We have to think of a counter-ideology. And I want to really go to a quote by Silvia Federici in this wonderful book of her essays, Revolution .0. And where Sylvia uses class and gender together. And no, it's on, I got the right page first. Yeah, here it is. It's a little long, so I'm going to go over my 1 minute. And she wants to talk. This is her first article on wages against housework. This is when I met Sylvia. Around the time this article came out, and we read the article, I was good friends with her friend Paolo Campagnaro. Campagnano. And she says, if we start from this analysis, we can see the revolutionary implications of the demand for wages for housework. It is the demand by which our nature ends and our struggle begins, because just to want wages for housework means to refuse that work as the expression of our nature, and therefore to refuse precisely the female role that capital has invented for us. To ask for wages for housework will by itself undermine the expectations that society has of us, since these expectations, the essence of our socialization, are all functional to our wageless condition in the home. In this sense, it is absurd to compare the struggle of women for wages for housework to the struggle of male workers in the factory for more wages. In struggling for more wages, the wage worker challenges his social role but remains in it. This is why this struggle by women becomes the foundation of what will also be a struggle for men and every other oppressed group. Just like what I said about Alambe. When we struggle for wages for housework, we struggle unambiguously and directly against our social role. In the same way, there is a qualitative difference between the struggles of the wage worker and the struggle of the slave for a wage against that slavery. It should be clear, however, that when we struggle for a wage, we do not struggle to enter capitalist relations because we have never been out of them. We struggle to break capital's plan for women, which is an essential moment of that division of labor and social power within the working class, through which capital has been able to maintain its hegemony. Wages for housework, then, is a revolutionary demand, not because by itself it destroys capital, but because it forces capital to restructure social relations in terms more favorable to us and consequently more favorable to the unity of the class. In fact, to demand wages for housework does not mean to say that if we are paid, we will continue to do this work. It means precisely the opposite. To say that we want wages for housework is the first step towards refusing to do it, because the demand for a wage makes our work visible, which is the most indispensable condition to begin struggle against it, both in its immediate aspect as housework and in its more insidious character as femininity. This is not just a quote for women. It is a quote for women. But women as the vanguard, just like Frantz Fanon's colonized people as a vanguard. I hate to be so Leninist. But Rick Wolfeld thought it was all right to be Leninist today, 10 times. So, though he never mentioned Lenin's name.
Oh, all right.
Take it.
Yay. All right, well, that wasn't that bad in terms of you're stealing all my quotes. You took some of them, but they'll overlap, and that's good. So, for some reason, I imagined you were going to have me talk first, and I kind of designed my thoughts, some of them anyway, as introductory to the notion of ideology. So just, I'll still do that. I'll give my general idea of sort of the introduction. What do we mean by ideology? And what's the role that ideology plays in capitalism? And then I want to talk about a few difficult problems and the issue of a counter-ideology and how that functions, okay? So, and please, anybody, feel free to interrupt me and discuss. I'm going to talk about media a little bit and a number of difficult issues, sort of quasi-philosophical issues. So feel free to interrupt me if I'm saying things that are not clear or you want to hear more about, or maybe I'm assuming that everything is totally clear and you have all the background for it and you're not. So just let me know. No worries about your interrupting me. Anyway, the notion of ideology itself only comes from the late 18th century, and that notion is basically just what does it sound like? An ideology is a set of ideas. It's a system of ideas that work together. So what we usually think of as a scientific theory itself is an ideology, right? And that's an important question in Marx's work. What's the relationship to scientific theories with respect to this notion of ideology, right? How does that work? I mean, there's a weird conundrum that attaches to the word ideology. It's a similar one that attaches to the word propaganda. Because we usually use those words when we have a negative connotation in mind. Something is ideology when it's a bad ideology, an ideology we don't like. And not, for example, a counter-ideology, a revolutionary counter-ideology. We tend not to want to call it ideology. We tend to want to call that science, the truth. You with me? And that's a tricky problem because we don't have a language that's completely neutral to talk about ideology and propaganda. And propaganda was so bad that the guy who wrote the book Propaganda in 1928 changed in the book itself. He talks about, he says, I don't want to call it propaganda. I want to call it, when I speak in public, I call it public relations. He invented that word, public relations. This is Edward Bernays. Edward Bernays wrote, he was a nephew of Sigmund Freud. Edward Bernays wrote a book, Propaganda, in 1928. I actually have a quote, I'll read it to you. This is the very first few sentences from that book. He wrote, this is Bernays, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions, so habits is what we do, opinions is what we believe, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. I'll just wait for you to stop laughing. Because you should laugh at that. I mean, that's pretty, I think, hysterical. Because if what we're doing is manipulating the masses, and this is the word he uses, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. If you're manipulating people, how do you at the same time call it democratic? This is a gem of ideological engineering.
Orwell understood it.
Huh?
Orwell understands it.
Who did?
Orwell.
Orwell
Double
understood
speak,
it,
right?
No, Orwell, all the great masters of ideology understood it. And Orwell was a master who was also critical of it. But in this days, before Orwell, you have Walter Lippmann, who comes before this as well, who has this notion of the engineering of consent that Chomsky has made much of to good effect. I mean, he should. And I'll read to you from Lippmann as well. Walter Lippmann was a Harvard philosopher who coined this notion, the engineering of consent, or the manufacture of consent. He wrote his book, public opinion in 1923, 5 years before Bernays' propaganda. They both were friends. They were friends. They both served on the Creel Committee, the Committee for Public Information, something like that, during World War I for Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson created this committee for creating propaganda during World War I, self-consciously deceiving the masses, manipulating them into supporting a war. Why? What was World War I about? Who could tell me what World War I was about?
Imperialism.
You could tell me. I often ask my undergraduate classes, I teach up at Lehman College, and I'll often ask my undergraduate classes, what was World War I about? If I get an answer, I usually don't get any answer, but if I get an answer, do you all know what I get?
The carving of Africa.
Yeah, no, I never get that answer, but that's the truth. It's about Africa. But what I usually get is, if I get anything, didn't some archduke get shot? Didn't somebody get assassinated? That's what really, it is the only answer I ever get when I get an answer. I usually don't get an answer. But when I get an answer, that's the answer I get. An archduke was assassinated, that happened, but that's not the cause of the war. That's how this is also a masterpiece of engineering. An ideology that has gone on is that people don't even know what it is to think about a cause of a war. What causes war? What causes a war? So an archduke getting assassinated in people's minds can be a cause of a war, right? Right? You all see that that's kind of fascinating, right? How can that be what people think? That's crazy, right? If you think about what a war is, that's crazy. Why would somebody's being assassinated be the cause of this massive mobilization of huge amounts of working class people?
So how would you compare that to World War II? Which had as much or more propaganda attached to it, and yet it seems on the surface to be more easy to validate.
Well, yeah, Howard Zinn talked about that quite a bit.
Totally.
The difference, and World War II is one of the
More
holy
complex.
wars. It's one of the wars that's, people generally accept as acceptable, a good war, he calls it.
And yet, most of it is not.
Right, absolutely. And there's a lot of propaganda in every war, and certainly World War II as much as World War I, and in many ways more so, because the machinery for propaganda was so much more refined by World War II. But let's leave that, because that could be the whole talk, and I have other things.
Well, it's just to show that the ideology of the greatest generation is coming from the liberal left.
Yeah, the
greatest
need to fight
generation
Hitler.
liberal.
Right, same thing with whatever is reasonable about getting our girls back. Yeah, there's something reasonable about getting our girls back. But what's going on is something else, right? And
Explain this Nigeria.
right, everybody understands what I'm talking about? Yes?
I know who Lambe Browns was.
Right, but everybody understands what I'm referring to here?
Yeah.
Nigeria.
Yeah, the Nigerian girls. Yes, this is a crime and it's terrible. But the United States is using it for its purposes. Nigeria, they've been trying to get into Nigeria for a number of years now. They completely want to control Central Africa all the way from east to west, and they've been trying through the DEA and through other means to get a foothold in Nigeria. And this is what they're using it for. Okay? Just like they using South Sudan and the crisis in South Sudan, this crisis in Sudan, they tried to use, they certainly used Rwanda and Congo, and the crises in Rwanda and Congo for the same type of neo-imperial control. But we can talk about all of these kinds of things too. This will lead us quite far afield from where I want to go. So. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. How is it democratic if we're being manipulated? How can he dare to use without, there's no, he didn't say, he didn't put in quotes, you know, to scare us, scare quotes. He didn't say, quote, democratic society. He says, oh, it's an important part of democratic society. It's quite amazing to me. He goes, those who manipulate, this is Bernays, those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. He's not saying this because he thinks this is bad. He's saying this because this is how he makes his living, and he thinks it's an important element that we need to exploit. We meaning the ruling class. And he's talking to the ruling class, who paid high money after he left. After World War I ended, he became one of the most richest individuals in the United States. He lived in New York. He was a nephew of Freud in Austria, in Vienna, but he lived here in New York. Okay, he became one of the wealthiest people in the United States because of his selling. He sold his skills to the White House. Calvin Coolidge hired him to be a public relations guy for him, as you call it. Quite amazing, right? Amazing stuff, right? He goes, we are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men, and I don't doubt that it's men we have never heard of. This is a logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. No irony here. He means it that way. He thinks this is democratic. It's like the contradiction there. So now, that's what I sort of want to get to, is where does, I'm going to talk about this in a couple of different examples, but you have some ideal. Okay, we can call this, I'm going to use a little language that comes from the philosopher Hegel, a la a philosopher named Mézières. Have you ever heard of Hegel and Mézières? Hegel, many of you have probably heard of, and Mézières is a Hungarian Marxist. He's living today, but he's very old and not well in England, but he's from Hungary. Istvan Mézières and Hegel. Hegel has this idea of a mediation. A mediation is an idea. You can just see that word as an idea. Why is a mediation an idea? Like the idea of, I don't know, a red fruit is an apple. Because that idea for me is what I use when I go and look for an apple. It mediates between me and the apple. Goes between me and the apple. Right? When I want to get, what do I want? I want one of those red juicy fruits. An apple. So an idea, the idea of an apple, is a mediation that goes between me and the actual object. You with me? So a mediation. So an ideal, I'm going to call this a first-order mediation. You have a first-order mediation. I mean, it's first level. It's just, I just want an apple. A red, juicy fruit, right? And what happens is, something real happens that gets in the way of my ideal. I'll put this reality. Something real happens that doesn't fit my ideal. Right? With the apple example, it doesn't help. It's not very clear to see this, but a good example, which I'll read you a beautiful. Okay, like take the good Christian bourgeoisie. The good Christian bourgeoisie, they believed they were good Christians when they went and enslaved African peoples and slaughtered indigenous peoples in the Americas. They were good people. They were Christians. Look, Jesus said, if I may preach the gospel, Jesus said, what you do to the least of these, my brethren, you do to me. Well, what they were doing to the least of these, their brethren, was enslaving them and slaughtering them. Oops. That's a real contradiction between the idea and the reality. There's a deep contradiction, right? So you need something. If you're going to keep this first order mediation, if you're going to keep this thing going in your noodle, you got to have something else to sort of, they're not going to give up their Christianity. That's their identity. That's their tradition. That's who they are. That's how they think of themselves. That's how they get up in the morning. We're good Christians. Yeah, but you're enslaving people and you're killing them. Like, Jesus didn't say that that was cool. Like you would have expected Jesus would think that that was a problem. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Jesus didn't mean them. Because they're not Christian and they are inferior to us. They're not as, that's it, they're not as good as us. So now we have a new mediation that went in between this and this. Right? Something is going between this mediation and this reality. This mediation didn't match up to this reality, and so a new mediation arises. And we can call this a second order mediation. Something went in between there, which is the theory of white supremacy, let's say. Right? The theory of white supremacy said that's how we get to be Christians, even if we're slaughtering people. Because those indigenous people in the Americas, they're not as good as us. God manifestly wanted us to kill them. Manifest destiny. That's another white supremacy, manifest destiny. Right? God obviously wants us to get there. Right? Even the idea that the bourgeoisie, like in the quote that Bill was reading from Capital, we toiled and saved. That's how we got our money, the bourgeoisie said. They invented something that never happened. We toiled and saved. That's how we got our money. You lazy people, you should be toiling and slaving too, because if you did, you'd be able to get rich like us. The only reason you're not rich is because you're not toiling and slaving and saving the way we did. Bullshit. They stole everything and they killed people. That's how they got their money. That's the bloody, what's that quote in the primitive accumulation chapter in Capital Volume 1? The bloody way that primitive accumulation happens. It's a violent, bloody historical fact, and that's the truth of it. But they invent this second order mediation, which is this mythology that plays this role in between a first order mediation and a reality that's too painful. I'll read you some quotes from some wonderful thinkers about this. Here's a quote from the great Joy DeGruy. Do you all know Joy DeGruy? Dr. DeGruy. She's often, you often will hear her on WBAI. She's an amazing psychologist. She wrote this in a book she has called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. She published in 2005. This is a tremendous book. It's really, really worth reading and thinking about. And if you don't know Joy DeGruy, it's worth looking her up. She has a lot of videos on YouTube. DeGruy. But here's something from her book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. She goes, when we commit a negative act or think about doing so, when we commit a negative act, this is a reality. We're thinking about doing this act. When we commit a negative act or think about doing so, most of us get uncomfortable. The discomfort is caused by the difference between our action and what we believe about ourselves, between the reality and this first order mediation. She goes, the discomfort is called cognitive dissonance. Okay? The greater the difference between our actions and what we think about ourselves, the greater the cognitive dissonance, and so our discomfort. Humans do not particularly like this discomfort, so whenever it occurs, we almost immediately try to resolve it. Very Hegelian notion, even though she never mentions Hegel, but this notion of resolving the contradiction between an idea and reality. I love how she puts this, and we can resolve it in one of two ways. One way is to own up to the negative act and address the harm caused by it. Make it better. Okay, I did something really wrong. All right, I messed up. I did something wrong. Well, if your bread is buttered by slaughtering indigenous people or enslaving people, you're not going to own up to it because that's where your bread is buttered. You don't want to own up to that because that means you really have to give back what you stole.
and what you took, and you have to make good. Look at Central Park 5. Nobody's owning up to that, right? They don't want to make good on that. They get to do what they want, and when they do wrong, oh, oops, sorry. That letterer, the assistant district attorney, she's a Columbia professor of law now. Wonderful. She prosecuted them. She prosecuted them. She got them to go to prison. Ruined their lives. But now she's a Columbia professor of law. I did my job. It's wonderful to read what she says about such things. Wonderful. I'm being sarcastic, if you don't know me. All right. One way is to own up to the negative act and address the harm caused. The other way is to justify the negative act rather than admit wrongdoing. They deserved it is a typical justification, right? Wife beaters, wife beater. She deserved it. She had it coming, right? This is a typical justification. Or when the cops say, he had a gun. He lunged at me with a knife, like this guy they killed in. Was in California this week. He had some shears, and they're saying he turned towards them, and they shot him down, and they were nowhere near. The guy, it's caught on film. There's nowhere near the cops. Like, he was turning to us with these garden shears, and they shot him down. They put like 12 bullets in the guy. Mejia, his name was a Latino guy. He deserved it. He had it coming to him. In instances of particularly egregious negative acts like wars of aggression, enslavement, and genocide, the perpetrators have gone so far as to demonize and in many cases dehumanize their victims. Right? This is white supremacy, for example. During the past 500 years, Europeans have spent significant resources to, quote, prove Africans and those of African descent are inferior. Chattel slavery and genocide of the Native American population were so un-Christian, the only way Europeans could make their actions acceptable and so resolve the dissonance was to relegate their victims to the level of subhuman. I think that's a marvelous, marvelous psychological description of what a phenomenology of how this pops up, how this becomes a part of the natural world. It's not natural, it's not real, but that's how it pops up. You have some view, you have some reality, and flowers up an idea, becomes a new kind of reality. And because the ruling class has the money, what does she say? She wrote, during the past 500 years, Europeans have spent significant resources to prove Africans and those of African descent are inferior. She's talking about the fact that the ruling class has the money to make this real. Not really, but in people's minds, to push this, to teach it in the schools. They control the schools, they control the media, they can get this idea to seem like the reality. Let me read you another quote by another great writer. This is from Hubert Harrison. Does everybody know Hubert Harrison? Okay, Hubert Harrison is one of the great writers of the Harlem Renaissance. He was originally from St. Croix in the Caribbean. He was one of the great black radicals and black socialists, and he wasn't in the Communist Party because it didn't exist when he first started his career, but he became a great, great hero and a big influence on people like Du Bois. Even though you don't know it, a lot of what is going on in Du Bois comes right from Hubert Harrison. And he's a powerful
Cornell
talked about it.
talked about him.
Wonderful.
Quite reverent.
Wonderful thing. It's pretty amazing that now there's a resurrection. I think a lot of it is
I think somebody's writing a multi.
Yeah, Jeff Perry is writing a brilliant, he wrote the first volume, wonderful multi-volume biography of Hubert Harrison. And he has been making Hubert Harrison's works available to people for the first time in a long, long time. And in many ways, he's been really, really helpful in bringing this a very important thinker and powerful thinker to people's attention. So it's a really great service that I just saw him. He's here today.
It's very old.
Jeff Perry, I mean.
Okay.
Hubert Harrison is dead. He died in the 20s. Yeah, he died in the 1920s.
Otherwise, he'd be very old.
Yeah, he'd be very old. But he was amazing. Here's a quote from him. This is from an essay that he wrote. Actually, even Jeff Perry doesn't know exactly when this essay, we don't know exactly when this essay was written. It was written at least by 1912, but it was published in 1917, and I'm getting it from a 1917 publication. I actually asked Jeff Perry about it because he's the expert on this, and he couldn't say for sure. He doesn't know for sure when it is, but at least by 1912 this was written. This is Hubert Harrison, an essay called The Real Negro Problem. He wrote, "Now, it's a social law, not yet proclaimed by our college sociologists." Sorry, Bill. This is 1912. I know you.
I was going to attack Talcott Parsons. I didn't have time.
All right, now, it's a social law, not yet proclaimed by our college. You're going to tease me about being a philosopher. I'll teach you about being a
That's all right. I'm not so proud to be a sociologist.
Okay. Now, it's a social law, not yet proclaimed by our college sociologists, that whenever a certain social arrangement is beneficial to any class in a society, that class soon develops the psychology of its own advantage and creates, insensibly, the ethics which will justify that social arrangement. Men to whom the vicarious labor of slaves meant culture and refinement, wealth and leisure and education, naturally came without any self-deception to see that slavery was right. You get it? Yeah, isn't it? I just find that an amazing quote, an amazingly lucid sort of generalization of the same process, right? So you see that this arrangement, you know, enslaving people, killing Indians and stealing their land, the indigenous Native Americans, and stealing their land, making treaty after treaty with them, and then breaking every treaty as soon as they've agreed, they've put down their weapons, they've accepted the treaty, they are in good faith. Now their defenses are down, now you take their land. Over and over, to this day, that is going on.
This was manifest destiny.
This is manifest destiny. When you're going to behave this way, you need an ideology. This thing pops up. There it is. You got this and you got this. You get this. And I love that, the dynamics of that process, right? Now, when Marx and Engels, and Bill started that wonderful quote, and I'll continue it since he started it for us, that wonderful quote from the German ideology. Bill read, "The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas," right? Do you all recall Bill saying this earlier? I.e., the class which is the ruling material force in society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. It's creating ideas that become ruling ideas, even if you don't want them to. Because if you control what's going into young people's minds, through the media and through the education system, which is really, in fact, in truth, a system of indoctrination, you are controlling their thoughts, right? I love, too, the ideology, like Hollywood plays a part in this in an interesting way. I mean, it plays many parts in it, but I just enjoy thinking about one of them, which is that Hollywood makes mind control look like they have to be putting drugs into you, or maybe wiring your brain or something, and that's mind control. Mind control is just what they teach you in school. That's mind control. Mind control isn't some fancy science fiction scenario. Mind control is just, you never get to hear the alternative. You never get to hear anything else. That's mind control. I mean, that's the fundamental fact of mind control. You with me? And I love thinking about that. I love thinking about the role that Hollywood plays in creating this imagery of the notion of mind control. Because then when you use the word mind control, people think you're kind of nuts. Like, what are you talking about, mind control? You're saying the government is drugging us? Like, like these people who argue that there's chemtrails like in the sky, you know, like these condensation trails from airplanes. That's all they are. But there are people who, you know, probably even people here at the Left Forum, who are arguing, you know, these conspiracy theories that this is mine. They're putting chemicals into us and they're controlling our minds.
Water, they love the
And
water.
in the water, the fluoride, and
fluoride.
which, you know, and they love, you know, this is,
Love
you know,
the fluoride.
they love, you know, all of these things. And okay, wonderful, and whatever. You get into an argument with people like this. It's like there's no evidence of these things, but yet they really strongly believe it. But okay, whatever. Mind control anyway is happening. It's just not. You don't need those to understand.
Well, when you rule, you don't have to do it sneakily behind anyone's back.
Yeah, you really
That's
do
why
it right,
conspiracy
hidden
theory,
in plain sight.
Bill talks about
Yeah.
conspiracy theory is unnecessary when you rule everything.
It's amazing
when
because
you have control, you don't need to conspire against yourself.
that's why, in a way, that's why I think of conspiracy theories as I have a conspiracy theory about conspiracy theories, I guess. You know, because I think of conspiracy theories like they're useless because they're getting you to think about stuff that's so. It's much simpler than that.
Well, it's not necessary.
It's so not necessary. Everything you
You
think
already control everything. Why do you need to conspire?
Yeah, it's very, at least in those particular ways that people imagine. In any event, and I have a feeling I'm running out of time, and I want to just finish up. I have a lot more I want to say, actually, but I kind of, we only have 20 minutes left, and I want to stop. I just want to hear what you guys think. Yeah.
Okay, so
And I guess, Bill, you're taking questions too, right?
Whatever people want to ask.
So
Yeah.
I have a comment and a couple of questions for you, and then, I don't know if I'll get them, but I just want to say that, this is off topic, but I have listened to you for years on WBAI, and I felt really bad when suddenly you weren't on the air. And what I always remember, and I have felt really bad that you had this terrible, I don't know, illness, whatever you call it.
I was in the hospital for 10 months.
I know. So, but I just want to say that one of the impacts you had on me was when you said once that people who beg aren't doing it for fun, so to speak. They're not doing it to just, you know, because they don't need it. They're doing it, and up until that time, every time somebody was begging on the street, I'd be so angry that they were approaching me. And I just had this totally different view of it, and I felt much better that I was able to give money to people. And so that was, it was very significant.
Big, small, small, big.
Yeah, it was very significant for me. I mean,
Well,
I mean,
very
just
moved
about
also.
how one is, I guess, talking about, you know, one's ideal for oneself and everything. And then when you said that, so questions, necessary for the capitalists to see themselves as good, isn't that really the Judeo-Christian?
Well, I think that's more Russell than me, but if you want me to
No,
answer
but I
I'll
mean, I
answer.
didn't understand how that's a capitalist.
Well, you know, it's interesting. I mean, there's a long history of this. I mean, the easiest way to talk about this is not through Marx, but through Max Weber. And Max Weber makes an argument in a very short book, actually. It looks bigger than it is because more than half the book is footnotes. Called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. He talks about, he's trying to figure out how rational capitalism is influenced by religion. And he comes up with his answer is basically about two things. I'm saying this because I agree with him. And I don't think this is counter to Marx in any way, even though it's often used as a critique of Marx. He says that Luther develops the notion of a calling. And in the notion of a calling, you live your life, every aspect of your life, as devotion to God. Then comes along, God, why am I blocking? Calvin, John Calvin. And John Calvin, who's this nasty bastard,
So is
he
Luther.
makes Luther look like an angel, because Luther's a nasty bastard also.
Yeah.
And he comes up and he says, listen, at the moment of creation, everybody's destiny was decided. And there's no way you can influence what God wanted at the moment of creation. And so, how do you live a life where on one level you're supposed to have a calling, right? You're supposed to have a calling in which you devote every aspect of your life to God. And second, that there's no way of knowing if you're going to heaven. That's Calvin. These ideas had much bigger influence than Calvinism or Lutheranism. And Weber makes a really typical sociological answer. And he says, well, how do people really live their lives? And the question is, about Calvin, how do you live an unlivable religion? Because Calvinism is an unlivable, how can you, the most important thing in your life is that you're going to go to heaven and you can't know it. So they make Weber says, they make a psychological leap. And the psychological leap that they make is to say that those who suffer and toil and are then successful are the chosen ones. All men are the chosen ones who will go to heaven. And the reality of it is there is no capitalism. It's what exploitation and alienation are about. Alienation and Marxists often misunderstood. They thought alienation was somehow a critique of exploitation. They fit together like peanut butter and jelly. We are alienated and exploited simultaneously, which means that being a worker in capitalism means you can only suffer and toil, and there will be no resolution. You will die, to the day you die, you will suffer and toil. Herbert Marcuse, affirmative culture in bourgeois society. And yet we don't, most of the time, we don't fight back. Stanley Aronowitz wrote a great essay in the most recent situation called Why Is There No Outrage? I think it's the winter 2014 issue of Situations. Why is there no outrage? Why are we so complacent? Right? Why is suffering so central to our lives? Our choice. See, this is very important to me because my life is about shortening the workday so that we can have freedom. So it can be just like it was when I was a hippie in the 60s. Getting stoned on acid and crystal methadone and having a wonderful time of sex, drugs, rock and roll, and protest. My religion. And I want that again. But you can't, because I must suffer and toil. My doctors did not want me to go back to work. But I went back to work. Why? Because I had to suffer and toil, otherwise I couldn't afford my apartment.
That's why, not because there was also an interest in working?
No, I mean, that's true. I do love teaching. But Susanna and I would have been out on the streets. We've been living with some friend. Maybe we would have gone to Holland, where we have rich friends, and they would have put us up. I'm sorry. Next question.
Sheila?
In answer to Alonowitz's question, why is there no outrage? I'd like to ask the audience here, how many people know somebody who's depressed? Is everybody, I can't see well, is everyone raising their hand?
Yes.
Although we all.
Brian wasn't,
probably
now he is.
Probably
John,
nobody
John,
knew. Probably the definition,
every
Okay.
single one of
the
us.
definition of that is maybe up for grabs, but we're gonna just like take it at face value.
Well, one of the amazing things about capitalism is I think it's a brilliant system. It's like an animal or an organism. It preserves itself. And one of the ways it does this is it doesn't have to kill its enemies because they get you to kill yourself through depression and by blaming yourself. In India, in the last 13 years, 250,000 farmers have committed suicide. 250,000. Now, imagine if those people had been members of a communist party, organized communists. Forget it. India would have been like 10 steps closer to like a revolution. And I find almost everyone I know is depressed. I mean, seriously depressed. How many people know people on antidepressants? It's like almost ubiquitous.
How many people in the room are on antidepressants?
People know people whose children under the age
Yes.
of 10
Yeah.
are on
Yes, we
antidepressants.
just heard of
Or
a friend of a
grandchildren.
friend of ours.
Start early, start.
yeah.
They start you early.
A friend, a young friend of
Mediation.
ours, has a young friend who just committed suicide, a
Yeah.
high school student.
So
It just
common.
Because she
Yeah.
was humiliated by
Ritalin.
one of her teachers.
She
It's
was
like
humiliated by a teacher.
Yeah, but it's also the Ritalin that's doing it.
Could be.
drugs, people are convinced, and this even spreads to the ruling class themselves. Even their children commit suicide because this is such an insidious
Those are
system.
the only ones we hear.
Well, is it the insidious system or is it the mediation that goes on within us?
Well, that's part of the system. I
Oh,
don't think,
that's
I mean,
what
that's, I
you're
think, part
saying.
of Sheila's point is that
It's
the
not
system
individual.
includes that mediation that brings us down and tears us down, in ourselves. It's
So-
not, it's a part of the system,
I think the confusion is that you think you're an individual.
yeah.
Exactly.
And we're,
I'm sorry,
Am I
that's
talking to
very
myself? Am I
challenging.
talking to myself now?
No,
no, but,
well,
I'm
no,
just
but
kidding.
no, but I mean, you think you're an individual in that you think you're independent from society because part of the ideology that's planted in you from a young age is that you are free in a democratic society
That's right.
and therefore an individual and somehow independent from society, and you're not.
and individualism is
responsible.
one of the fundamental,
And you're not.
that's one of the fundamental
Essential.
ideological
The freedom thing.
second order.
I see
reasons.
people with the freedom
Yeah.
t-shirts. Oh my God, it's so disturbing.
And materially, we are broken down. I mean, really, especially since World War II, the working class has been, when I was a kid, even in the 1960s and 70s, you still had at least some people would go out bowling and people would go out and, I don't know, do stuff together. Today, people don't do that anymore. People play video games, people watch
Well,
television, people watch cable.
There are
They-
also fewer places to go that remind you of you, because everything has become Disney World.
Right,
I think of Lower Broadway
right.
in the city. That used to be one crazy, wacky, dirty, messy store after another,
Right.
with a few kind of charming things thrown in. It was like a real neighborhood, thingies and people and all kinds of, and now it's just Disney World.
Yeah, well,
And you
42nd
can find
Street,
it at any airport in the country.
everything is a mall. Everything is
Everything is a mall.
a kind of.
So
we-
where do you need to go? You could find the same thing on Amazon. You don't
Everything
need
is the
to go
same.
abroad.
You don't need to go anywhere, even to church. I mean, there's very little community of any sort. People are materially turned into individuals. And now with unions, at less than 10% of the workforce are in unions, and most of them are in government jobs, right? So the non-government workforce is not even in unions. So the basic idea that Marx had, that it would be capital that having the seeds of its own destruction, right, would force people together into factories and the workplaces so they'd be together and they'd realize their solidarity and start their class struggle together.
If they
that
became
has been,
conscious. He always had an if clause, if they became conscious.
Well, but that's how they would become conscious, because together they would see their exploitation. Even that has been globalized. The workforce is so globalized. Like Ross Perot's famous saying, there's this race to the bottom globally. You know, the jobs are, what was the saying? All the jobs would go south when NAFTA was signed, right? What was that phrase?
Sucking sound.
Sucking sound, heading south, right, exactly, right?
He was right on.
Yeah, totally
He
right, actually.
was wrong, because the jobs left the
So
South
they went to
Well,
China.
and went to Asia.
But
Yeah,
he's read an
afterwards, that's
article
true.
how they're
South
coming
Asia,
back.
and some are coming
They've
back,
come back from China to Mexico.
just a few.
But isn't the point, going back to what I guess Bill, you were saying earlier, is that you know, we're sitting here talking about, it's like we have this whole process to figure it out. We're looking at ideas, we're looking at the idea of mediation, and we looked at this whole thing called propaganda, we looked at this whole thing called religion. And so obviously me sitting here sort of figures out, well, you know, regardless of class or whether we think we're in a class, it's this whole influence of religion, regardless of whether it comes out of India or Europe, that makes us feel like we're blaming ourselves for our own lack of manifest destiny. So if we know that, if we know how it works, shouldn't we be about creating something different as opposed to just criticizing what's going on?
Well, that's why Stanley
Yes.
wrote, "Where is the outrage?" Where? You're right.
I would recommend a book. Now, the writer has completely the wrong conclusion, but I would recommend a health book called Healthy at 100. And the reason I recommend it is because this guy, it's written
What's
by
his name?
John Robbins, the heir to the ice cream fortune.
Baskin.
Baskin Robbins, yeah, he rejected all that money and he became like a vegan or something. But he describes cultures in which people routinely live to be like 100 years old. And what they all have in common, aside from the fact that they live in the fresh air, they eat organic vegetables, is that they all are non-exploitative societies. They're not capitalists. They all care for each other. Old people are cared for and are productive well into their hundreds, if they look to be in their hundreds. The children are treated kindly. People, they take care of each other. There's no exploitation going
And
on in
there's
these
a
societies.
number of
It's central.
societies today that are like that,
aspect.
actually.
There's a central aspect to the society. They also, and I would disagree with the working 5 hours. If you read Healthy at 100, you want to work.
Yeah.
Because if you are not exploited, work is not the same as work. It's different. It's going out and tending your garden, it's taking care of your family and your neighbors, it's et cetera, et cetera. It's life.
Well, it
these
almost
stories.
deserves a different name.
Marx
Yeah.
is talking really about labor.
Not work,
And so
no,
it's
not just
labor
working
is
there.
exploited and alienated in capitalist society. You
Right.
know, and in different societies, there are different, structures. But I would like to just mention something that's very important. I wanted to talk about Charles Murray, because I partly wanted to get to Talcott Parsons, who was arguably the most famous sociologist of the 20th century, and actually had tremendous influence on psychology and political science, and on Charles Murray. And what Talcott Parsons came up, I'm not going to run through the whole thing, which I have very short, I can explain very short. The problem is, how do you get people, he called it their status roles, how do you get people to play their status roles? Why do you get up in the morning when the clock rings and get ready and go to work or go to school, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And here you have, for him, the internalization of cultural values guarantee the conformity required to play your status roles in society. And it's very interesting because Murray, the dean of poverty, pro-poverty legislation, makes that same argument. He argues that cultural values have to be internalized, and one of the problems of 2014 is that the
new ruling class is not internalizing the values. He says they don't have the confidence to rule. He's not afraid of using the word class. They do not have the confidence to rule. The best should rule. Those who do not conform to the basic values, I'm just going to read them, of industriousness, honesty, heterosexual marriage, and religiosity are culturally and often biologically inferior.
He's a sociologist?
He's a
Charles Murray.
He's your average
economist,
American.
I think, technically.
He's a what?
Very,
He's, I think, technically an economist, but he's
Very
broad.
important.
He's at Harvard. He wrote a book with Richard Herrnstein called The Bell Curve, in which he demonstrates the biological inferiority of.
And these are supposed to be the smartest
of
people
color.
at Harvard?
No, what
Oh,
you have
no,
at Harvard
he's
is the
famous.
most conformist
He's
intellectuals.
very famous.
Back in the days, he used to appear on Phil Donahue,
Yeah.
and he would come with a computer, and he, to verify his facts.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we don't have talk shows like that. We got Oprah and all this other crap.
Yeah.
He's still alive?
Yeah.
I think so.
Murray, sure.
Yeah.
He
The
just wrote
the
his
second
book,
volume of
2012, Coming Apart.
He's not related to Murray's chickens, is he?
No, he's actually more important.
So
The
what's
second
it?
volume of Stephen Jay Gould's book, The Mismeasure of Man,
Yeah,
has
yeah.
a lovely appendix and, basically a critique of the bell curve.
Yeah,
It's
he
really
has a-
worth
he
reading.
does the bell curve man really beautiful.
Yeah, he does a great job.
He's a
But
good
it has
reader.
not gone away. And
It has not
Murray's-
gone away,
Murray's
right?
still
And-
alive,
Yep.
and Gould is dead.
But Stephen Jay Gould definitely is worth a read. If you've never read him, he's a hoot.
Yeah.
A highly entertaining writer who's incredibly satisfying at debunking a lot of the
And what did he write?
mediated ideology.
Well, you got everybody
The
saying.
Mismeasure of Man is his famous one, and it's just a collection of
Have to go to
essays
the
that are-
mediation.
Yes, totally.
What are some of those societies that you're referring to that are that are not capitalistic?
Well, like in Okinawa and what was it?
The Abkhasians?
The Abkhasians and the Caucasus Mountains.
Okay.
Isn't there those Greek islands where people live past 100
I
or
don't
almost
know.
everyone
Yeah, I
lives
don't know
to
all
the
of them.
late
Sheila
90s.
read the book, yeah.
And they also live lives like
Are we out of time?
describing.
No, this one.
Yeah,
They're
please.
very rich and full of
I just want to, when we say that why aren't the people outraged? Can we say this because since the late 1973, the wages have been stagnated. Basically, we're in survival mode.
We're
Students
overwhelmed.
are paying off debt. A lot of us are finding it hard, as me and Bill have talked about, to afford living in this city because of everything has gone up except our wages, and some of us might have credit card debt, and we're just in this survival mode that we're so preoccupied now with surviving,
Yeah.
and that's another thing that I think is just.
We're overwhelmed, we're overworked. We have
And
no
we don't have
time
time to
for
be outraged and
we
to
just want to
express
fall
outrage.
down and go to sleep or when we're not like struggling just
And to go
get
back to
around.
what the lady here said, and that's another reason why we're depressed.
Yeah.
taking drugs to try to
Yeah.
like, make it.
Anything to, and drugs are another mediation between some idea of what we're supposed to be and the reality that's just too harsh to
Right.
deal with.
Well, why not look at the other way? What about the fact that how many thousands of people came to the Left Forum?
Yeah.
How many organizations are here
Yeah.
that were recreated after the destruction of the unions?
Yeah.
You know, like we're doing more. There's way more organizations fighting way more things
Yeah,
now.
well, that's something to think about too, though, is that there are 1.5 million. 1.5 million, is that right? Look on the Foundation Center webpage. 1.5 million nonprofit organizations in the United States today. Think about that. 1.5 million. That means for every 200 people, there's one
nonprofit. Now imagine, now how much good is that doing us? If we had 1.5 million Soviets, direct democracy run organizations with just 200 people each in it. Think about that. Instead of 1.5 million nonprofit organizations that are doing what? What are they doing
They're
for
doing
us?
amazing things, some of them. As somebody
No.
who's on the board of directors of
I'm
two nonprofits, no, I'm just going to say, I'm part of the People's Firehouse. The People's Firehouse manages affordable apartments and a nursing home for people. The problem, though, Russell, I basically agree with you. The problem is that people believe in policy.
Yeah. Yeah. They think ultimately...
See, I don't like the way this conference is coined as reform or revolution, because they leave out the word policy. They leave out, I mean, who am I? I'm Dr. William DiFazio, a tenured full professor. I'm a professional bureaucrat of knowledge. I mean, that's what I am. And the only reason I got there is because I wrote a bunch of books. And if I didn't write the books, I'd be teaching as an adjunct or doing something else. I mean, that's part of the problem. I'm part of the problem.
I knew somebody here. Well, I think we're out of time, right?
We are.
Yeah, so, but thank you all for coming. I really do very much. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
It kind of made my day.
By the way,
I had told Stanley Aronowitz that a couple years
I
ago
think people
before you
are
were back on the
outraged.
air.
Yeah, I do too.
I think people are, they're just not organized.
Yeah, I think
And you
it's
know
like,
what's the fact is we are being
Ken is
out-organized
the
by
saying,
the right wing.
people are, I think he's right, it's just that they're beaten
Right
by
wing is
the fact of their lives, but I think they are outraged at the same time. Yeah, it's just why is that not coming? And they can't get out in the streets because they are busy taking care of their kids, or just taking care of themselves, paying the rent.